It was just an ordinary inspection at a quiet airport outside Atlanta until everything went wrong. A brilliant black aerospace engineer walked onto the tarmac, ready to check on the very aircraft she helped design. But instead of being welcomed, she was surrounded by officers, accused of trespassing, and detained for hours. They didn't believe her ID. They didn't believe her name. What they didn't know: she was the chief designer of the multi-million-dollar prototype they thought she was tampering with. What happened next not only stunned the officers, but shook the entire aviation industry. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that matter. It began with the light. That merciless southern light that makes no room for illusions. It poured over the small municipal airport outside Atlanta the way truth pours into a room too long locked, sharp, blinding, without apology. Dr. Celeste Freeman stood there, on the blistering edge of the tarmac, holding nothing more than her badge, her breath, and a heart that had learned to beat quietly under the weight of centuries. The airport, on a Sunday morning, was nearly empty. But that didn't matter. It never mattered. Because for a black woman, especially one as brilliant as Celeste, the absence of people has never meant the absence of judgment. She was here not for spectacle but for science. A plane, a prototype, her design, her child, really waited inside a private hangar. Years of work, theories tested and retested, fuel equations carved into her notebooks at 2 a.m., quiet prayers murmured to dead ancestors who had been denied such dreams. This was not just aluminum and jet fuel. This was vindication, shaped into wings. She walked slowly, not out of hesitance, but discipline. Because any sudden movement, a misstep, a glance perceived as wrong, might become her downfall. You learn that in America. You learn it early if you're black. And if you're brilliant and black, you learn it with every success, every degree, every time you walk into a space that wasn't built with you in mind. Celeste wore a simple dark polo, slacks, and work shoes. No frills, no shine. Just competence. Her Lockridge Aerospace badge dangled from her neck like a question nobody had yet dared ask. The guards weren't at the gate this morning. No one nodded at her with the usual vague familiarity. That should have been nothing. But it wasn't. Because when a black woman walks alone, she knows better than to assume she's invisible or safe. Her phone buzzed. A voice crackled through. "Celeste, how's she looking?" It was Marcus Delgado, her supervisor. "Beautiful," she answered, eyes tracing the gentle arc of the prototype's nose, the sleek lines of the wing. "She's ready to stretch her wings. Just make sure the mods from last week hold." Wing drag looked high in the sim. "I'm on it." She ended the call. That should have been the day. That should have been all. A woman and her machine. Quiet genius, doing its work in the daylight. But America has a way of turning a black woman's ordinary into someone else's threat. It started with the sound, tires grinding against gravel, the low whine of a siren. 2 police cruisers, cutting across the field like blood through linen. The sun glared off their windshields. A show of force for a woman holding a clipboard. The first officer, white, barrel-chested, early 40s, stepped out with a hand already resting near his hip. "Ma'am," he said, like it was both a courtesy and a warning. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here?" She lifted her badge. "Dr. Celeste Freeman, lead designer on the Horizon V. I'm conducting an inspection." The second officer squinted at the badge, tilted his head like a man trying to read in a language he didn't believe you spoke. "You got clearance?" She offered a soft nod. "Yes, you can call Lockridge Aerospace. I'm on the list." They didn't call. Not yet. They didn't ask the questions that would have ended it all quickly. Instead, they asked others. "Where's your team? Are you here alone? What's in the bag?" And always that look that said you are not supposed to be here, and if you are, you better beg us to believe it. That's the rhythm of racism in this country. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's slow, like the tightening of a belt. It comes in questions asked too many times, in eyes that look through your credentials and see only the skin they don't trust. Celeste remained calm, because rage, though earned, is often taken as confession. "Would you like me to call my supervisor?" she asked. One of the officers stepped closer. "No sudden movements, ma'am." The line between safety and suspicion had thinned. She stood there, caught in the dissonance. How could the same hands that engineered this marvel be the ones now cuffed in a stranger's imagination? And in that heat, with the plane beside her glistening like a vision, Celeste understood again what her grandmother used to say: "You can build the house, baby, but they'll still ask if you're trespassing." This was just the beginning. The overture. The first breath of a storm that had no name yet. Because while the plane was ready to rise, the world still had trouble seeing the woman who gave it wings. The thing about power in America, real power, is that it rarely announces itself with clarity. It prefers instead the disguise of procedure, the comfort of protocol. In Chapter 1, it was suspicion masked as safety. In Chapter 2, it comes cloaked in civility, wrapped in the quiet contempt of institutional memory. Dr. Celeste Freeman sat in the small, soulless interrogation room, the kind of place designed to strip away dignity with every whitewashed wall and flickering fluorescent light. She wasn't handcuffed, no, not yet. That would have been too obvious, too loud. But she might as well have been. Her autonomy had been reduced to a chair, a table, and a badge that nobody seemed eager to validate. They said it was standard. A misunderstanding. They needed to verify. What they meant, without ever saying it, was that she didn't look like a lead aerospace engineer. Not to them. Not in that space. Not in that skin. Outside, her aircraft sat idle, its polished surface reflecting the very woman who had helped design every inch of its form. But inside, Celeste was being asked questions that had nothing to do with lift, drag, or propulsion. Where did you go to school? Have you worked with classified materials? What's your relationship to the security personnel on site? She answered each calmly, precisely. Georgia Tech. Yes, professional only. But every response felt like a stone skipping across the surface of doubt. No matter how fast or smooth her words, they barely skimmed the surface of the assumption beneath, the quiet, festering belief that a black woman in a high place must be a fraud. And she knew, oh, she knew, how deeply that belief ran. She'd seen it in boardrooms where her ideas were ignored until spoken by a white man. She'd heard it in the echo of elevator silence when she walked in wearing her lab coat. She'd felt it in the uneasy glances of new interns wondering if she was the diversity hire or the janitor. You see, for the black professional in America, every room is a proving ground. Every degree, every accolade is a receipt of entry, and still, you're asked for more. They let her make one call. Just one. She dialed Martin Delgado, her supervisor, the man who had championed her talent when others had merely tolerated it. He picked up on the second ring. "Celeste? What's going on?" She kept her voice even. "They've detained me. They say they're trying to verify my credentials." A pause, then a sharp exhale. "They what?" "I showed them my badge. My ID. They said someone called in a report. Stay put. I'm making some calls. This is ridiculous." She thanked him, knowing full well that even his voice, as a white man of stature in the aerospace world, might not be enough. But it was something. And in that moment, something was all she had. An hour passed. Then two. A soft knock, and the door opened again. A new face entered, Captain McAllister, a polished man with a veneer of apology stretched thin over his discomfort. "Dr. Freeman," he began, with the false warmth of a man trained in public relations, "I want to personally apologize for the delay. We've confirmed your credentials with Lockridge. You're free to go." He offered a smile meant to pacify, to erase the insult with charm. But Celeste did not smile. "Captain," she said, standing slowly, "your officers detained me for inspecting a plane I designed. They questioned my education, my motives, even the contents of my bag. And when I tried to call for verification, I was treated like a threat. McAllister's expression faltered. They were responding to a report. We have to follow protocol. No, Celeste interrupted, her voice steady but firm. You followed fear. She gathered her things without another word, her steps slow, deliberate. Outside, the sunlight greeted her like an old friend, warm and indifferent. She inhaled deeply, the scent of jet fuel and summer air mixing in her lungs. But something had shifted. Because this wasn't just about her. It never had been. This was about how easily brilliance can be reduced to suspicion. How deeply this country doubts black excellence when it doesn't arrive in the costume they expect. And as Celeste looked out across the tarmac, she knew this was not the end. It was only the next chapter. The next test. The next quiet war between dignity and doubt. And she was ready. There are moments in a person's life when silence becomes unbearable. Not the silence of solitude, but that cold, heavy hush imposed by the world when it refuses to see you. Chapter 3 begins not with violence, but with that silence. The kind that follows a room full of people who have already made up their minds. Dr. Celeste Freeman had returned to her apartment that evening with her limbs sore and her pride bruised. The events at the airport, her detainment, her questioning, her release with a reluctant apology, had not made headlines. No cameras were there. No social media storm. Just her and a memory that sat on her chest like a stone. She walked into her lab the next morning wearing the same ID badge they had doubted. The same calm demeanor. But something had changed. The building greeted her like it always did, white walls, gleaming floors, the low hum of machines calculating futures. Yet, this time, the walls whispered. Her colleagues looked up when she entered. A few nodded. A couple avoided her gaze. One younger engineer, Peter, offered a tight-lipped smile, the kind you give someone at a funeral. And then there was Claire. Claire had always been polite. But politeness, in the American sense, is not the absence of prejudice. It's the art of hiding it behind good grammar and clipped tones. I heard you had an incident, Claire said, her voice light, too light over coffee. Celeste nodded, keeping her voice even. Yes. Police questioned me at the airport while inspecting the aircraft. Claire tilted her head. Well, I suppose with everything going on these days, they were just being careful. Careful. That word sat on Celeste's tongue like ash. Careful was the excuse used for every slight. Every interruption. Every ignored suggestion in a meeting. Every time a white colleague repeated her idea 10 minutes later and received applause. But Celeste smiled, because that's what she'd been trained to do. Careful, she repeated softly, is often just another word for scared. And fear is rarely neutral. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Later that day, a scheduled team meeting took place to review the next phase of the aircraft's development. Celeste sat at the head of the long table as lead designer. She had earned that seat through years of work, of night shifts, of staying twice as long as anyone else to ensure every blueprint bore her integrity. But midway through the meeting, she noticed the pattern again. Her notes were brushed aside for new perspectives. Her concern about a stability issue was met with a polite, "We'll revisit that." And when Peter, the young engineer, mentioned a change she had suggested 3 weeks prior, the room erupted in nods and backpats. She sat still. She did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. But in her silence, the tension inside her began to crack, like the pressure inside a fuselage ignored for too long. After the meeting, she returned to her desk, her fingers shaking slightly as she clicked through her notes. Her voice had been stolen in that room, not by force, but by familiarity. They didn't ignore her because they didn't know her. They ignored her because they did. She was the brilliant black woman who had already made it. What more did she want? Why wasn't her presence enough? Because presence is not power. She stared at the prototype model of the aircraft sitting on her desk. It looked perfect, sleek, efficient, like progress. But inside, she felt the familiar hollowness. Progress in America, she thought, is often cosmetic. That evening, she got a call from her mother. "You all right, baby?" Celeste hadn't told her mother about the incident. But news had a way of traveling through families like smoke through cracks. "I'm managing," Celeste said. Her mother paused. "You don't sound like it." Celeste exhaled. "They doubted me, Mama. Not just the police. My own colleagues." Her mother's voice softened. "Of course they did. They don't know what to do with a black woman who's smarter than them. Who walks like she belongs because she does." Celeste smiled faintly. Her mother always had a way of making truth sound like scripture. "But let me tell you something," her mother continued. "Don't you let them take your voice. Don't shrink. Don't whisper. You speak loud. You speak plain. You speak true. Because you ain't just working for that plane, you're building a path." Celeste hung up and stared out the window. The city lights blinked like indifferent stars. Somewhere out there were a dozen young black girls dreaming about science, about engines, about reaching beyond the clouds. She wasn't just designing a machine. She was building a future. The next day, Celeste walked back into the lab, not as someone asking for permission, but as someone who had already earned her place. And this time, when they spoke over her, she didn't wait to be acknowledged. She spoke louder, clearer, and she didn't flinch when they squirmed. Because the truth is this: racism doesn't always wear a hood or scream slurs. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it nods. Sometimes it sits across from you at a table and says, "We'll think about it." And sometimes the only way to answer that lie is to speak a truth so loud, so steady, they can't pretend not to hear it. That was the lesson of Chapter 3. The fire hadn't started yet, but the kindling had been laid. There are days when injustice walks in like a breeze, light, almost invisible, curling beneath your collar, chilling your spine without ever announcing its name. Chapter 4 was such a day. It began quietly, but ended with a reckoning. Because every mask of civility eventually slips, and every silence will one day beg to be broken. Celeste Freeman arrived at the city's annual Aerospace Advancement Symposium, a gathering of engineers, policymakers, and corporate giants designed to showcase technological innovation. She had been invited to speak on fuel efficiency advancements in next-generation aircraft, a topic she had practically written the book on. Her name was in the program. Her face was on the flyer. And yet, the moment she entered the venue, she was greeted not with recognition, but with suspicion. The man at the check-in table, wearing a navy blazer 2 sizes too tight and a smile a little too thin, scanned her badge and then looked her up and down. "Are you sure you're in the right place, ma'am?" The words came coated in sugar. But sugar, as our people know, can rot through the teeth of dignity if you let it linger too long. "I'm presenting in panel 3, Celeste replied, holding her composure. "You'll find my name in the program. Dr. Freeman." He hesitated, checked the list again, and then, reluctantly, waved her through. Now, if this were an isolated event, it could be dismissed. But that is the lie society tells itself, that racism is a single moment, a lone insult, a single bad actor. In truth, it is a constellation of slights, repetitions, omissions. It is the air itself, tainted and unavoidable. Inside the grand ballroom, Celeste took a seat near the front, placing her notes on her lap, heart steady. But soon, she noticed how the other speakers, mostly white, mostly men, greeted each other warmly, shook hands, slapped backs. She offered a polite nod to a fellow aerospace engineer she had met at a previous conference. He glanced her way, then quickly looked elsewhere. When it came time for the panels to begin, Celeste's microphone didn't work. She watched as the technician, red-faced and flustered, fumbled with wires, glancing toward her as though she were somehow to blame for the static in the system. The delay stretched 5 minutes. Then 10. Finally, when her voice did come through, it was to a room already half distracted. Phones were out. Conversations had restarted in the back rows. Still, she began. She spoke with clarity and command. Her research, tested across countless simulations, offered groundbreaking ways to reduce drag and increase fuel efficiency. The equations came alive through her words. She made the sky understandable, tameable, but the applause at the end was tepid. Afterward, at the networking mixer, a senior VP from a major aviation firm cornered her at the punch bowl. "You were impressive," he said, swirling his drink. "I have to admit, I didn't expect someone like you to deliver such technical detail." "Someone like you?" Celeste smiled tightly. "You mean someone with a PhD and 10 years of field experience?" The man laughed nervously, as if to deflect his own discomfort. The room around them buzzed with low conversations. Celeste could feel it again, the second-guessing, the sideways glances, the assumptions. Even in a room where she was a featured expert, she was still being tested. But what pierced the veil most sharply came near the end of the night. As she gathered her things, Celeste overheard two men speaking near the corridor. "Who was that again?" one asked. "The black woman? Some DI pick, I think. You know how these things go. A DI pick." As if her accolades, her research, her published papers were nothing but camouflage for quota politics. Celeste froze, her breath caught between anger and exhaustion. Because you see, at a certain point, the daily weight of being doubted, dismissed, and diminished grinds down on the spirit, not because it's unexpected, but because it's expected and still allowed to thrive. She walked out of the ballroom into the cool night air. The city stretched before her, lit with glass towers and endless possibility. But her gaze fell downward, to the sidewalk cracks, the places people forget to look. In her hotel room, she sat at the edge of the bed and opened her laptop. She pulled up the video of her presentation. And then, slowly, methodically, she drafted an op-ed, not just about fuel efficiency, but about the costs of working twice as hard to be seen as half as capable. About how innovation dies in rooms where only certain voices are valued. About how science must evolve, not just in what it builds, but in who it chooses to believe. She sent it to every industry journal she could think of. And then she closed her computer, turned off the light, and lay in the dark, not defeated, but coiled. Waiting, preparing. Because sometimes progress doesn't come from applause. Sometimes it begins in anger, in truth, in the determination not to be erased. Chapter 4 did not end in resolution. It ended in fire. Quiet, slow-burning, but inevitable. And from that fire, something would have to rise. You see, what folks don't always understand, especially those who have never had to flinch at the sound of authority, never had to explain their presence in a room they built, is that the greatest insult ain't always loud. It's not a slur shouted across a sidewalk or a punch thrown in the dark. Sometimes it comes dressed in politeness, stitched tight with a smile. Sometimes it shows up with a handshake that feels like a dismissal, a nod that carries no weight. Celeste Freeman knew that kind of insult all too well. And by now, she'd grown used to the pattern. Admiration, followed by skepticism. Invitations, followed by avoidance. This chapter of her life began in the soft hum of an office building, glass-walled, temperature-controlled, the kind of place that prides itself on being inclusive, though the air inside still managed to feel segregated. The aviation firm had requested her consultation on a project that had stalled, something to do with a propulsion model that refused to behave in simulation. Celeste had been recommended by a younger black engineer in the department, one of the few who dared to vouch out loud for someone who looked like him. She arrived at the office on a Monday, her briefcase full of schematics and her mind clear. The receptionist, a woman with too much lipstick and too little eye contact, looked up and blinked when Celeste introduced herself. "Oh," she said, glancing toward the back hallway. "You're Dr. Freeman?" Celeste nodded once. "Yes." The woman hesitated, as if she expected someone else. Someone taller, paler, male. Well, she said, recovering quickly, go on back. They're expecting you. Celeste stepped into the conference room where a dozen engineers, mostly white, mostly men, sat hunched over papers and screens. They barely looked up. One of them, a senior VP named Rick Hammond, did rise to greet her, but he shook her hand like it was something borrowed. Thanks for coming in, he said. Let's see what you've got. Celeste didn't flinch. She never did. She opened her laptop and walked them through her approach, point by point, equation by equation. The room grew quieter. Even Hammond furrowed his brow, absorbing the brilliance he hadn't expected. But then it began. Well, someone said after a long pause, it's a unique perspective. Unique. That word again. The word they used when they didn't want to say it was correct. Another voice chimed in. Are you sure those assumptions are industry standard? Celeste tilted her head. They're not only standard, they're foundational. Check the last 3 papers published by MIT's Propulsion Lab. The man gave a tight smile. Of course. Just double-checking. And there it was, the doubt, the second-guessing, the way they would nod and smile and undermine all in the same breath. But the real test came 2 days later. Celeste had submitted her full proposal for how to rework the propulsion model, complete with simulations, budget estimates, and rollout timelines. She knew the solution was sound. Even Rick Hammond had begrudgingly admitted as much. But when the project report was sent to upper management, Celeste's name was missing from the header. Not buried in the footnotes. Missing entirely. She discovered it accidentally when one of the junior engineers forwarded her a copy with a casual "thought you'd want to see the draft before final approval." Her name, her work, had been rewritten under the lead of 2 senior team members who hadn't contributed a single algorithm. Celeste stared at the screen, her pulse cold and steady. Now, some folks might have shrugged. Take the paycheck. Let the insult slide into the shadows where so many others had gone before. But Celeste Freeman did not belong to the generation that took silence for safety. She printed the report, annotated it in red ink, and walked it straight into Rick Hammond's office. He looked up, clearly surprised. You've got 5 minutes, she said, placing the papers on his desk. That's all I need to explain what plagiarism looks like. Rick flinched. Now hold on, Dr. Freeman, let's not escalate. This isn't escalation, she cut in, voice low and precise. This is me giving you a chance to fix this before I call it what it is. Theft. Theft covered in diplomacy. He opened his mouth to speak, but Celeste wasn't finished. I've spent 20 years doing work that men like you take credit for. Not anymore. I'm not here to be applauded. I'm here to be recognized. And if you can't do that, I'll find someone who will. There was no shouting, no dramatics, just truth. Cold, clear, unavoidable. He blinked, unsure whether to fire her or promote her. The fact that he had to consider both options was the purest evidence of his discomfort. That evening, Celeste walked out of the office with her laptop slung over one shoulder, the Atlanta air thick with rain and memory. She thought of her father, who worked 2 jobs and taught her how to fix a carburetor before she knew how to braid her hair. She thought of her mother, who cleaned other people's homes, but always made her own smell like resilience. She thought of all the names that never made it to the reports. All the brilliance that got buried. And she vowed, quietly, not to let hers be one of them. Because in this country, the battle for recognition is not just about dignity, it is about history. And those who control the record control the future. Celeste Freeman would not be erased. And the storm, just beyond the horizon, was beginning to rumble. They say time heals, but in America, time also hides. It hides the insult you swallowed on a Monday morning, the doors that never opened though you had the key, the smile stretched across a face that couldn't hide its fear of your blackness. Celeste Freeman, no stranger to this nation's sleight of hand, now found herself walking deeper into a game she never agreed to play, but had long since mastered. It had been 3 weeks since she forced the company's leadership to reinstate her name on the propulsion report. And though they obliged, they did it the way a man might patch a tire he fully intends to ignore again tomorrow, quietly, resentfully, without acknowledgement. But Celeste didn't come for acknowledgement anymore. She came for accountability. Still, the air in the office had changed. You know the kind. Polite hellos curdling into whispers as soon as you pass, coffee invitations suddenly drying up like puddles in July. Even the junior engineers who once looked up to her now kept their heads low, fearing guilt by association with the woman who dared to speak truth to power. That kind of truth is contagious and dangerous. Then came the budget review meeting. Celeste had submitted a secondary proposal, an initiative to diversify recruitment pipelines by partnering with engineering programs at historically Black colleges and universities. She'd spent months researching cost projections, outreach strategies, and long-term ROI. It was airtight, necessary, and, for the firm, revolutionary. When she stepped into the sleek glass boardroom, the CEO, Robert Fairchild, offered a firm nod. "Dr. Freeman," he said, "thank you for joining." There were 12 people in that room, 11 of them white. One of them is her. The presentation began. Celeste walked through slides with measured grace, building her case not on emotion but on data, efficiency, and equity. Her voice was calm, but underneath, it carried generations of restraint, of knowing that brilliance often had to speak twice as loud to be heard half as far. When she finished, silence. Then Fairchild cleared his throat. "It's an interesting idea," he said. "But we're not in the business of social experiments. We hire the best, regardless of background." Celeste's smile didn't waver. "I'm not proposing an experiment. I'm proposing a correction to a system that hasn't looked far enough to find the best in the first place." Another executive leaned forward. "Are you suggesting we haven't been fair in our hiring practices?" Celeste didn't blink. "I'm saying your definition of fair may not be the same as mine, or my father's, or the young woman at Spelman who can outcalculate anyone in this building but hasn't been offered the chance." The tension was palpable now, thick as molasses and twice as slow to move. "We appreciate your perspective," Fairchild said. "We'll take it under advisement." The meeting adjourned without a vote. Celeste walked out into the hallway, past polished nameplates and framed photos of grinning executives, all men, all pale, all history stacked on top of itself. The truth of racism, she had long realized, wasn't just in slurs or police stops, it was in delays, deferrals, the endless "we'll take it under advisement." She made her way to the elevator, head high, shoulders square. 2 floors down, in the engineering lab, something else was unraveling. A small team had been working late on the Horizon Z, a military application of the jet propulsion system she'd helped pioneer. Celeste hadn't been looped into the testing phase. No explanation, just silence. She discovered it only when a younger colleague, Marcus, came to her with worry written all over his face. "They've been pulling your model apart," he said. "Replacing components. Stripping your name from the schematics." Celeste felt the sting rise in her throat, hot and bitter. Again. She stormed into the lab unannounced, clipboard in hand, her heels loud against the linoleum. "I'd like to know why changes are being made to the Freeman model without my review," she said flatly. Heads turned. One man, blonde, 40-ish, senior engineer, spoke up. "It's not the Freeman model anymore. It's a team model." Celeste stepped forward. "That team was built on my calculations, my design, my research. You don't get to erase that because it makes you uncomfortable." The man smirked. "You're being sensitive." And there it was again. That word. Like a blade hidden in velvet. Sensitive was how they dismissed your rage. Sensitive was how they covered their theft and civility. Celeste leaned in close. "I am being accurate. And if you keep removing my contributions without attribution, I'll take it to court." Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to listen. She returned to her office that night after filing a formal complaint. Alone. No congratulations. No handshakes. Just the sound of the city outside, horns, sirens, and the long, low hum of a country still learning to see its shadows. And yet, as Celeste stared out the window, she didn't feel defeated. She felt prepared. Because this slow tightening of the noose, this death by 1,000 shrugs, was the America she had always known. And she, Celeste Freeman, was done asking for a seat. She was bringing her own chair. Bolted. Reinforced. Ready. There comes a moment in every country's reckoning when the stage is set. The actors are summoned, and the curtain rises not for a performance, but for a trial of the nation's conscience. This hearing, called to investigate the company's internal discrimination complaint, was never just about protocols or policy. It was about power. It was about the weight of a black woman's word when set beside white discomfort. And it was about what we choose to excuse and whom we are too afraid to hold accountable. Celeste Freeman walked into the downtown conference room not as an accuser, but as a mirror. What she was about to say wouldn't just expose a single offense. It would lay bare a culture that smiled in her face and smudged her name behind closed doors. Outside the corporate headquarters, the morning air was tense and overcast. Protesters had gathered. Students from local HBCUs. Engineers with signs reading "Merit isn't colorblind." Even a few former employees who'd left the company in quiet frustration now stood in solidarity, faces sharpened with purpose. Inside, the executives sat around a long oak table, each with a leather folder, a bottle of water, and that trademark stiffness of men used to controlling the narrative. Fairchild, the CEO, nodded for Celeste to begin. His tone, as always, was polite, syrupy sweet with professionalism, yet dense with the weight of all the doors he'd helped keep closed. Celeste cleared her throat, not to speak louder, but to steady her rage. "I'm here today because I've been asked to explain my actions," she said, eyes trained not on her accusers, but on the recorders in the room. "But I'm going to explain yours." She began methodically. She walked through the moments where her work was repackaged under someone else's name. The diversity proposal that had been shelved without discussion. The lab tests that deliberately excluded her feedback. She spoke of subtle offenses, the meeting invites that never came, the offhand jokes about hiring quotas, the patronizing nods when she spoke, the suspicious eyes when she succeeded. She paused. "None of you ever called me a slur," she said. "But you called me difficult, defensive, aggressive. Those were your slurs." There was a silence then, heavy and awkward. The kind of silence that white men in power rarely sit in unless forced to. Fairchild shifted in his seat. "Dr. Freeman," he said, "no one here ever intended to discriminate against you. You must understand this is a misunderstanding, not malice." She smiled, sad and sharp. "Of course. It's always a misunderstanding. The system never has a face. It only has shadows." That afternoon, a second panel, this one with federal investigators from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, joined the proceedings. And now the stakes have changed. Suddenly, the men who had laughed off her concerns weeks ago leaned forward, speaking in polished legal tones, careful with every word. A different kind of performance had begun. Celeste was asked to recount the incident in the lab. The name is removed. The retaliation. And she did, with receipts, with screenshots, with emails, and with a paper trail that painted a picture too complete to ignore. When the company's lawyer asked, "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" she answered, "Because every time I did, you told me to calm down." And I did. Until I couldn't. Outside, the protesters had grown. Word was spreading online. News vans parked along the block. What began as one black woman defending her dignity was turning into something much larger, a reckoning that no badge, title, or polished degree could stop. That evening, as the panel broke for the day, Celeste stepped out into the fading light. Cameras flashed. Reporters called her name. But she wasn't interested in being anyone's headline. She just wanted to breathe. Back at her apartment, she sat by the window, watching the city settle. In the distance, sirens sang their usual night song. She thought about her grandmother's hands, how they'd lifted her, braided her hair, and prayed for a world that didn't yet exist. Celeste knew she hadn't won anything yet. But she had spoken. And they had listened. That alone was a revolution. There is no quiet victory when it comes to dignity. It does not arrive in fanfare. It is carved, slowly, painfully, out of moments when a person dares to remain whole in a world that insists they be shattered. The final chapter of Celeste Freeman's ordeal didn't unfold in a courtroom, nor a boardroom, nor on the front page of the Times. No. It unfolded in living rooms across America, in hushed conversations between fathers and sons, in the wary glances exchanged across office cubicles, in the weathered faces of elders who had long grown weary of saying, "We told you so." After the hearing, after the press conference, after the corporate statements dripping with damage control and delay, there came the reckoning. Not because the company willed it, but because the people demanded it. And the people, those who bore the cost of being unseen, had been watching. Celeste did not want fame. She wanted a fair shot. But the world had now made her its reluctant symbol. Newspapers called her the aerospace truth-teller. Blogs crowned her a quiet storm. Invitations flooded in, from universities, think tanks, advocacy groups. She declined the most, because she knew what they really wanted. Not her story, but her silence dressed in applause. She was not interested in becoming another black body paraded for the comfort of white guilt. She was interested in change. Still, she chose one speaking engagement. A community college in Birmingham, her father's hometown. A place where black boys still whispered dreams of flight with the shame of knowing no one expected them to lift off. Celeste stood in that auditorium, in front of rows of brown faces, wrinkled with hope and hardened by reality. And she told the truth. "You will walk into rooms where they will pretend you do not exist," she said. "And when they see you, they will wish you hadn't spoken. Speak anyway." An older man, gray-bearded, with eyes that had seen Selma and beyond, raised his hand during the Q&A. "Miss Freeman," he asked, voice cracking, "do you think we've really moved forward, or just sideways?" Celeste took a long breath. "Sometimes we've crawled. Sometimes we've been dragged back. But sometimes we've leapt." He nodded, slowly, like someone who'd been waiting a long time to hear that word spoken without apology. Weeks passed. The company implemented new policies. Diversity boards were formed. Training was mandated. Officers from the airport were reassigned. But Celeste knew bureaucracy could not fix what culture had eroded. So she kept pressing. She joined a nonprofit advancing black girls in engineering. She testified again, this time before the Senate Subcommittee on Workplace Discrimination. Her voice was firmer. Her stories are more precise. This time, they didn't dare cut her off. Meanwhile, back at the company, whispers spread about who might replace Dr. Charles, the white VP of development who had retired early. Celeste ignored the gossip. She wasn't here to take a man's seat. She was here to build new tables. One morning, she received an envelope. Handwritten. Inside was a letter from a retired black pilot who had flown for the Air Force in Vietnam. "I never thought I'd see the day they had to look someone like you in the eye," it read. "Thank you for making them see." She wept, not because it was sentimental, but because it was too familiar. Because the burden always returns, passed from palm to palm like a torch in a storm. And still, somehow, we keep the flame. On the anniversary of the hearing, Celeste visited her grandmother's grave. She placed a single rivet from the aircraft, the one whose design she had helped refine despite the noise, the doubt, the disbelief. "They tried to call me a mistake," she whispered to the headstone. "But I made something that flies." And there it was. The quiet revolution. Not in the headlines. Not in the courtroom. But in the sky. In that moment, Beneath a pale Alabama sun, Celeste Freeman became more than an engineer. She became a witness, a steward, a reminder that America's greatest threat has never been its enemies, but its refusal to look at itself in the mirror of its own citizens' pain. And her story, like those of so many before her, asked one final question. If we can build machines that defy gravity, why, after all these years, do we still struggle to lift the weight of each other's humanity?